So myself and James are going to do a double act today. So just to flag, really, as Ella said, this is the 5th webinar in the series. So there's already been 4, if you've missed any of those, and there'll be 3 more. So the next one will be on meta-ethnography, which is another approach to synthesizing qualitative research, in March. You can go to the next slide, James. So what we're going to talk about for the next hour, we've divided it into different sections and have allowed some time for question and answers. So James is firstly going to talk about how thematic synthesis is being used before giving an overview of the methods and some of its key features. And at that point, we'll pause for questions just for 5 minutes. And this will be questions really related to those kind of higher level features and overview. And then I will go into talking about the steps involved in thematic synthesis in a bit more detail. And I'll also talk about a little bit about how you might go about assessing the synthesis, the robustness of thematic synthesis. And then finally, I'll end with a few tips around planning the thematic synthesis. So I think I'm going to hand over to James for the next slides.
Great, thanks very much, Angela, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you all this morning. So I'm going to give you a sort of like an introduction to the high-level picture of how thematic synthesis has been used and what it can do, and roughly at a sort of an abstract level how it works. And then Angela will take you through the detail. So we have one slide on how thematic synthesis has been used. We've got a scale back on the left there. I did delete the scale at one point because I was thinking, well, this isn't a sort of a formal sample. This is a sample of about 200 reviews, which we looked at recently, which have used thematic synthesis and have stuck quite closely to one of the papers. So this isn't necessarily representative of all thematic synthesis, but it's indicative of some of the objectives which people have used thematic synthesis to fulfill. So you can see that on the whole, it's around people's perspectives and experiences, as you might expect of a qualitative evidence synthesis. Just about the most common type of objective has been reviews around intervention perspectives, so people's experiences and understandings of being involved in receiving interventions. That also includes carers. So there's sort of people who are maybe partly delivering an intervention there. And that's distinct from intervention provider perspectives, which is a smaller bar just on the right there, which would be more sort of nurses and doctors and other health workers. So definitely quite a lot around intervention. There are questions around acceptability, stigma, and intervention implementation in thematic synthesis. There's relatively small number around understanding effectiveness. I was expecting to find more than that, but that's the sample that we found so far. And the one where we've got stakeholder panel perspectives, there's actually just one there. It doesn't even register as on the bar, but something where the person doing or the people doing the thematic synthesis have both synthesized the research literature, but have also had quite a main role for a stakeholder panel where their perspectives were also integrated into the synthesis. So over on the left, you can see that people's understandings and experiences, possibly of particular health conditions, outside interventions are also synthesized using thematic synthesis. There's a fair number of studies on trial recruitment, and some of those have been analyzed using this method. We've also been identifying reviews which have looked at issues relating to equity, and there are a few syntheses using thematic synthesis as a method which have used primary research as their data and also non-health topics. There's an interesting one on mountaineering, for example, that if you're wanting to find, I can point you towards. So broadly, you can see the types of questions, the types of objectives that reviews have used thematic synthesis to address, broadly around intervention, people's experiences of receiving interventions, and people's experiences more generally around particular health conditions. And there's a fair number on equity, which crosses over sort of between international development often and health. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key features of thematic synthesis now. A lot of this is based on a paper that Angela and I wrote back in, well, it was published in 2008, so I actually wrote it a few years before that, where we sort of set out some of the methods which we'd developed as part of a systematic or a series of systematic reviews looking at children's obesity and young people. So that's the context within which we developed some of the ideas for the method. And so that's an open access paper you can download if you like. So broadly speaking, I'm sure most of you know already, what is thematic synthesis? It's a method of synthesis. It can be employed within systematic reviews, and its objective is to synthesize findings from multiple qualitative studies. And the method, if you're thinking about sort of the paradigm of synthesis, it's not an aggregative method. The idea is that you're wanting to configure findings, you're wanting to build up a picture of what the findings say across the studies, rather than necessarily find the same thing in lots of different studies and described in lots of different ways. There's been a paper which actually was published before the 2008 paper, which would have been really helpful to have seen in the time when we were working on the method, which was actually 2003, which is a great paper if you've not seen it and you're interested in thematic analysis and thematic synthesis. It's definitely got to be on your reading list, where this is Braun and Clark's paper, which looks at thematic analysis in primary research, and they define some of the key concepts there quite nicely. So a theme capturing something important about the data in relation to the research question, representing some level of pattern response or meaning within the data set. So there's some sort of quite obvious parallels with synthesis there. The fact that you're looking for something which is patterned within the data set. It's not just something you see once necessarily, and also that it is in relation to the research question. And we're going to come back to the importance of that in a little while. So it's a method for identifying, analyzing, and reporting the patterns in the data. So and what's nice about this second definition is it talks about organizing and describing your data set in rich detail. So that's a really important part of thematic synthesis as well. And then, however, it often goes further than this and interprets various aspects of the research topic. So you've got those two important components of thematic analysis there, thematic synthesis, where you may be describing and encapsulating the content of your research in detail, but then also sometimes you go further than this in terms of interpretation and addressing a research question in particular ways. So I'll come back to those are important themes, if you like, when you're thinking about thematic analysis. So the key contributions that we see that thematic synthesis has made is that it offers us a formal method from moving from the text on the page through to synthesis. So it was developed within the context of doing systematic reviews, and we had our systematic review, transparency, audit trail hats on when we were working on it. And so we wanted something which enabled us to be clear about where we'd got our data from and be able to sort of transfer and translate that, and someone looking at it can see what we did from the text on the page right through into our findings. So the idea is that readers and the authors who were working on the review can trace those conclusions right back into the primary study. So there's a good bit of accountability there. And another sort of key contribution of it is that it can be used in conjunction with other methods of qualitative evidence synthesis. We'll say a bit more about that as we go. So there are three main stages, and they relate a little bit to what I was referring to on the previous slide around this distinction between describing what you've got in the data set and then inferring answers to your research questions. So the first part of a thematic synthesis, which Angela will do in more detail than I'm going to describe now, is very much looking at the data. We call this sort of open coding and line by line coding as a real discipline within the method, where you identify the findings within the study, and you literally read every single line of the findings and you code every single line and consider what those findings mean in relation both to the other studies and also in relation to answering the review question. But critically, what we do want to be making sure that we do is looking carefully at every line of findings. You know, the authors have written those words for a reason, and what we wanted to make sure we did was we didn't just bring our preconceived notions about what we were expecting to find there and sort of taking the themes out that, you know, that sort of sprung to mind immediately. We wanted something that made us actually consider what we were doing, and this discipline of looking at every single line and coding every single line helped us to do that. There's this bullet point in italics there, axial coding to capture study context. And that's a really important part of this. So when we were working on this, we wrote little snippets of text for each study, which encapsulated the context of the study, the context of the participants, so that we didn't remove the sort of like the findings of the study from the context within which they were generated. So that's always a tension with any kind of systematic review, any kind of synthesis, you know, whatever type you're doing, is the embeddedness of the data within the context within which it was generated. And so the way that we made sure that that was not forgotten in this was around both capturing these, writing these snippets of text to capture what the study context was about, but then also reviewing the codes, this axial coding around those contexts, those snippets of context, to make sure that we didn't sort of divorce one from the other. So the coding stays very close to what the text on the page is. You know, code is potentially just sort of data reduction to say that this sentence is about this particular theme. And once you start looking across studies, you start developing descriptive themes, which are essentially codes or concepts which you're seeing in more than one study. And what we're trying to do here is to stay very close to the text. We're not trying to interpret them particularly, we're trying to translate them into one another, which is a really important concept. So where they're saying the same thing but in different words, we're wanting to make sure that we say this is, you know, that these people are saying the same thing as these people, they've got the same experiences here, and we're not trying to go beyond what they say, we're just trying to make sure that we understand the range of themes within the data set. What happens next then is the third stage of the analytical themes, where we're interpreting those descriptive themes in the light of the review question. Sometimes the descriptive themes simply answer the review question and you don't really need to do very much. And other times there needs to be a certain amount of interpretation on the side of the reviewers in order to address the review question with what the primary studies have said. So that's one of the reasons that we're really clear about these different stages, that we can then look back across the data set, and at the end, when we've got the analytical themes, we can follow them back through into the descriptive themes and through into the line by line coding, so we can see exactly which pieces of text and which studies have contributed to which finding. So I've talked quite a lot about this key feature, the line-by-line coding of text. It's key cognitive and communication process. We find it's best done in small pairs or a small team. There were 3 of us originally sat around the computer doing our line-by-line coding. And what it's really good for, it makes you explicit about what your understandings are across the team. And you know, if you're the one with the mouse selecting text, other people can then say, well, why are you doing that? And it forces you to be really clear and to express and to be explicit about what your interpretation, understanding of the text is. So you get good consistency in terms of your interpretation of the text across the studies within the team. And like the last bullet point says, it forces us to be clear about all the findings rather than just those which align with our preconceived ideas. So being developed within the context of a systematic review, we try to make it a good fit in terms of its alignment with the principles of systematic reviewing. So it provides this audit trail of reviewer decisions from the text in the paper through to the findings and the conclusions of the review. But it's quite flexible. And so I'm sure Andrew mentioned that within framework synthesis, for example, you can use it as a method, as some of that discipline of the line-by-line coding, for example, within a framework synthesis in order to connect, you know, the pieces of text there with the conceptual framework, with the framework that you're using within that synthesis. Likewise, you can use it as a standalone tool, and you know, it's sort of like this grounded theory approach where all of the theory that you're generating is coming out of the source documents. So the last bullet points, one of those where depending on the type of review you're doing is more or less important. So sometimes you can do quite a descriptive analysis and that kind of does the job for whatever the review is trying to do. Sometimes it doesn't. And what you're aiming to do there is to generate some new theories, some new connections, a new conceptual framework possibly, which then can be used either within another part of the review or as a review output in and of itself. But there's this idea that sometimes you stick just with what the studies are saying, and sometimes you're able to generate new theory, which to a certain degree or to a large extent goes beyond the content of those studies, depending on what the review's needs are. So in terms of its relationship to other methods of qualitative evidence synthesis, they've got their different names, but obviously they're synthesizing qualitative evidence. They've obviously got some commonalities. So framework synthesis you've already heard about, and a big gain from framework synthesis, I think, is that it benefits from pre-existing theory. If someone else has already, if there's a body of literature which has been working for years on an existing theory, then you can sort of stand on the shoulders of giants, if you like, and you can really benefit from that. Sometimes it's easier and quicker to use with novice teams with short review time scales if you've got that theory to start with. So I think that's where it works if you've got a good theory, because obviously on the con side, if you don't have a theory to start with, it can be quite challenging and time consuming to go and find one. And also sometimes you start with a framework which looks as though it's going to work, and then once you start the synthesis, you discover it doesn't. And we've experienced that in the past where we've started a framework synthesis. The theory actually didn't work for the data that we had, and then we switched into doing a thematic synthesis in order to generate a new theory. So thematic synthesis is handy because it can handle thin and thick data, if you like, and it gives this audit trail, and it can be structured to answer the review questions directly. But I mean, you can imagine from the discipline of all that line-by-line coding, it can be very time-consuming if you've got lots of studies, and it can feel a bit overwhelming if you've got lots and lots of studies, because you know you've got so many themes and so many possible ways of understanding and organizing them that you know you've got lots of trees, but it's actually quite hard to see the wood for all of the trees. So it's not always easy. It requires some some good analytical skills at times. And then sort of going down in the next in terms of the interpretive sort of content of the methods, meta-ethnography is probably the most interpretative method that we've got on the list here. It's really good for considering theoretical findings. It does require some pretty good data at times. And obviously then the demands on the team are such that you want an experienced team, a team that's experienced in this type of qualitative research. It's not designed with a sort of like a systematic review hat on in terms of its audit trail. So if you're wanting sort of more of that, then following emerge guidelines may help, and sort of sometimes you can use a sort of a thematic synthesis method or sort of some of that line-by-line coding within a meta-ethnography as well, in order to provide that audit trail. I feel quite as though I've thrown a lot of concepts at you there. So there's one very easy question. Yes, you can have the slides. The slides will be up there. But yes, if we've got a few questions now for me to answer or Angela to answer, I'd be very happy to.
Hi, James. The chat's been really, really busy. Can Katie and I have clarified quite a lot as that we go along. And I know that you want to stick to high level things now about the things that you've talked about, and that Angela will go through the sort of more nuts and bolts of how to do a thematic synthesis. There was sort of one question about the difference between narrative synthesis and thematic synthesis, and Katie really helpfully answered that in the chat about narrative synthesis being a slightly different approach, and that was more akin with thinking about a three-stage approach to integrating more effect data. And this was thematic synthesis is a qualitative approach to synthesize qualitative data. So what might be really helpful here is if you can actually really pin down what is a qualitative study, if you can help us with that. And I can see that John David has got his hand up. John, if you can put your question in the chat, please. We're not taking live questions, but if you put your question in the chat, then I can ask it of James.
Oh dear, you've asked me the impossible question there, Jane. In some respects, there's no such thing in terms of sort of epistemology. It's very difficult to really say that there's this big distinction between qualitative and quantitative at one level. On another level, it's obvious that there are clear differences in terms of dealing with numbers and words. The typical way of thinking about this is firstly that you're dealing with the type of research where people have sought people's perspectives. They want to represent their understandings and their points of view, and understand what their motivations are, potentially as sort of as individuals, but also the way in which they interact with their environment, and build up larger sort of more abstract social theories around how societies work. So a lot of that tends to be what you might think of as qualitative work, which is a rationalist epistemology, which is around thinking about interpreting what people are saying and developing theory. So what you typically have in a qualitative study is data which has come through from interviews or from focus groups, which is rich in contextual detail. And then you use methods of analysis which are appropriate to that type of data. So you might use a thematic analysis, for example, where you're examining the data in detail and you're understanding the connections and the places where people are agreeing and are disagreeing in terms of what they're saying. And the objective is often to build up some theory which describes and encapsulates the understandings and the meanings of the people concerned. So I think that's the type of study that we're thinking of in terms of synthesizing here. I don't know whether, as the sort of the convener of the group, Jane, if you want to come in on defining what qualitative evidence is beyond that. But I mean, sometimes it's a little bit tautological. People sort of say a qualitative study is one that's used qualitative data and a qualitative method of analysis. And I hope that that's given you some kind of insight in terms of what types of study we're thinking about here. But yeah, Jane, please.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. A study that uses a qualitative data method of data collection and a qualitative method of data analysis sounds absolutely perfect. There was lots of people who have asked for copies of the papers that you've been citing. And I just think it would be helpful to have a clarification that the Braun and Clark method, which is for primary qualitative data analysis, isn't as extensive as it's less useful as a method of synthesis, in the fact that your method goes a little bit further. So would you like to just outline what does your method of thematic synthesis add to the Braun and Clark method of primary qualitative data analysis?
I think the Braun and Clark paper is fantastic. It's a must read if you're working in this area. I think the thing about our paper is that it's designed specifically around systematic reviews and the needs of systematic reviews. And also it's sort of got that perspective on it, which is that, you know, systematic reviews not only want to be right because, you know, they're used to inform decisions, but that, you know, they're part of this audit trail of sort of data through into decision making, and so you want to make sure that you know, you're particularly clear about the way in which you've conducted the research and the conclusions that you've drawn from it. And so those two elements, I think, are probably what separates the two. One, I mean, it's designed for systematic reviews, which is why it works for systematic reviews, but also it's designed for systematic reviews in such a way that it helps you to be really clear about the different stages that you've gone through, because it helps you with those expectations around transparency.
Lovely. So one last question, and it's a biggie, so you might want to give a short answer to it and refer people back to the slides because you have covered it. But Anna and Eleanor have asked, is qualitative thematic synthesis, there's also meta-ethnography and meta-aggregative reviews. What are the differences? When should we use thematic synthesis? I think you've sort of covered that in the slides already. And Eleanor says, how's thematic synthesis different to content analysis? The line-by-line coding seems similar. So if you could just give a few hints and tips on that.
Yeah, I think, Eleanor, I think thematic synthesis does have elements of content analysis in it, certainly. There are overlaps between lots of these methods. In terms of the difference between it and meta-aggregative and meta-ethnography, I've partly covered that, but I think it's probably an opportunity to plug a book that will be coming up soon, which will be covering all of these issues in quite a lot of detail, which the Qualitative and Implementation Methods group is working on at the moment. So there are similarities and there are differences. And I think probably in that previous slide here, we've sort of got, the slide doesn't seem to be moving now. Let's go back to, there we go. Here, I suppose you could sort of almost think of it on a continuum of sort of the sort of like the least to the most interpretative approaches, possibly. Only or the most sort of data driven from one where you've got a sort of framework to begin with. There are similarities and differences, and you know, like what I said, you can use thematic synthesis within framework, you know, some of the methods within a framework synthesis, and you can use some of the methods within meta-ethnographies. So they're not completely clear cut. They're sort of, they overlap with one another to a certain degree.